All right, verse 16. We're moving along, and we did the first part of verse 16 last week, for from his fullness we have all received. We did that last week, and now John tells us what we have received, and he says it's grace upon grace. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, grace upon grace. Now, I think what this phrase means is verse 17. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So I believe what he is saying, and I'm not the only one, this is the consensus, is that grace upon grace is an explanation of what do we do with Moses. Now that Jesus has come and we can now receive the fullness of God the Father through Jesus, the new mediator of the new covenant, what are we to do with Moses? Which was a big question in those days. You'll remember a lot of the debates that Jesus had with the Pharisees and scribes. A lot of the debates had to do with what he thought about Moses and what he was teaching about Moses in the temple and the Old Testament system. And so John is going to answer this very important question. And we saw that John is primarily writing to Jews. And so this is a big question that Jews would have is what is the relationship between Moses and Jesus? And he says the relationship, he sums it up with the phrase grace upon grace, which is one wave of grace after another wave of grace. So Moses is grace, Jesus is more grace, and like layered pancakes. That is typically the consensus of how translators translated grace upon grace. And so John is saying not that Jesus is replacing Moses, but fulfilling Moses. Not that Jesus is the instead of Moses, but he is the fulfillment, the culmination. And what I say often around here is that the New Testament is the blossoming of all that came before. It's not the total replacement, but it is the blossoming of the old. Make sense? In a devotional sense, some writers will point out that personally we can consider all that God gives us as layers or waves of grace, and that because we receive the fullness of God through Jesus Christ, that fullness comes to us like an overflowing fountain or a spring that is welling up inside, and we can always drink from it. So grace upon grace upon grace. That's true personally, but what John is primarily saying is that now that Jesus has come in the fullness, what do we do with Moses? Well, it's grace upon grace. And he explains it a little bit in the next verse. He says the law came through Moses, grace and truth through Jesus. So the question, though, is how can law be grace? Now, when we read it, and you tell me if this is true, when you read it, grace upon grace, the law was given through Moses. Can anyone admit to the fact that when you read that, that sounds negative, doesn't it? The law, pretend that you haven't been discipled in Christ Church for years, but just your old self, not knowing much about the law comes through Moses. Oh, that's the bad one. And then grace and truth through Jesus. John's point is not that there was no grace or truth in the law. It's not like the law is condemnation and falsehood. That's grace and truth is probably some sort of covenantal language or expression. He's just saying the law, that is the Mosaic administration of the covenant. All that they were holding fast and dear to Moses, the temple, the festivals, that comes through Moses. That's grace. But then we have now the full covenantal faithfulness, grace and truth, the fulfillment, the blossoming in Jesus. Makes sense? So, but how can law be grace? I think this is very important, and this is actually what distinguishes Reformed, Westminster, confessionalism, and much of other types of Christianity, is this particular question, we believe that the law is grace. It's grace upon grace. The law is grace, even though it doesn't sound at first glance like that would be grace. In our dispensational minds, we hear law, okay, that's works, and now grace, we're saved by grace. That's kind of how we read it, but that's not what John is saying. the Old Testament relationship that the Jews had with God was a good relationship. It was an intimate relationship, but it was structured by a covenant. And this is all review, but for anyone who's new to this, it was structured by a covenant, and that covenant had a law within it. And when you have a law inside of a covenant, it's simply the terms and conditions of receiving the blessings of the covenant. Make sense? All right? And so the law proper, the rules, those were the terms and conditions of the law. Big picture, big L law, the covenant that was made with Moses. And that word law, Torah, is used in a lot of different ways. It can be used for the rules themselves, but it can also, because the rules and the covenant are so closely related, it can also be used for the covenant as a whole. And I think that's what John is saying, is that Old Testament covenant, quote unquote, the Torah, the law, that was given to us by Moses. It does contain what we think of as laws, rules, the terms and conditions of the covenant. So does that make sense? And then if they keep those laws, like legalists, what do you think? No, Paul says the law is good if you use it lawfully. If they keep those laws through faith and they love God and they trust Him and they obey, then He will give them life and abundance and prosperity, right? Obey this law, it is your life. Not earn salvation. They were already saved out of Egypt when this was explained to them. It's how to intensify the blessings of the covenant relationship they were brought into by grace. Does everyone understand that? It's not easy to understand necessarily. You have to hear it over and over and over again. But the covenant relationship that God was in with Israel was a covenant of grace. The law in there is a part of that gracious covenant and is showing them how to live to intensify their blessings under the canopy of grace. That's what Westminster teaches. That's what I believe. Everything that I preach is based on that particular structure and concept. Deuteronomy 4:8. What great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law? You see, Israel was seen as a great nation, a favored nation. God said, I didn't choose you because you were big and because you were impressive. I chose you because I chose you. I put my heart upon you. It was a gracious relationship that God reached down and chose Israel, right? And it wasn't because of them keeping a law. They didn't even know Him. He visited Abraham. He comes to them in Egypt because of His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He heard their cries and He saved them. It was all a gracious relationship. He delivers them through the waters of baptism in the Red Sea. He feeds them with the sacrament of the bread from heaven and the water from the rock. And He gathers them together as His people. And then He writes down an expression of Himself in the covenant and the law and says, if you keep this, you're going to be blessed. I'm with you. I'm on your side. We're in a good relationship here. Obey these laws and you will live. Other reasons the law can be gracious, just real quick. The law also, it fends them off from the Gentile pagan nations, kind of kept them in a little safe cocoon, like God kind of homeschooled them in the wilderness to keep them away from all the losers out there. So that was gracious. The law was a tutor that taught them the categories of the gospel and atonement, right? How do we know about sacrificial lambs and that sin requires an atonement and justification? All those categories are taught to them ceremonially through the law. You don't just know those things. You aren't just born knowing those categories. You're lost and blind and dead in your sin. And He teaches them the categories of the gospel through the law, through all of the ceremonial rules and whatnot. The law also taught them what God was like. God was holy. God was truthful, right? God was faithful to His covenants. God didn't steal and murder. This is what God is like. He loves life. He loves private property. It taught them the character of God. It showed them their need for a sacrifice because the law, and everyone is condemned under the law, and so you can now be shown and persuaded that you need Jesus. Isn't that gracious? Isn't it nice? It maybe feels bad for a minute, but it's gracious ultimately. The law guides us in how to live. It guided them in how to live. And the law showed them how to intensify the blessings upon blessings, grace upon grace upon grace for the rest of their individual and household and national lives. So I believe the law is grace, even though that sounds weird to some. That can sound weird. It really sounds weird to Lutherans, but you don't know any of those, so let's not worry about that. I don't think you do. Anyone know a Lutheran? You know one Lutheran? Not from around here, though, huh? Yeah. Miss Sharon, you don't know any Lutherans from around here? You probably do, but you don't know they're Lutherans. Yeah, there's a few Lutherans around. There's a church over in by Rufino's. That's a Lutheran church, but there's not a lot of people there anymore. I don't know, and I'm pretty sure it's liberal. So we won't spend. But Lutherans love to make a distinction between law and gospel, law and grace. They're always making that distinction, and I'm not a Lutheran. I believe the law is an aspect of God's gracious covenant that he made with Israel and the church. And so, but how do the other people, how do others relate the Old Testament to the New Testament? I like grace upon grace. That's what the translators all chose. But that preposition between the word grace and grace, I think it's ante, is not, it has a range of meaning. Is it grace for grace, or grace upon grace, or grace instead of grace? The translators put the word that they think makes the best sense out of the context. I think it's the right word. And I don't want to make an entire theological point on a preposition. That's not what we're doing. But I like that expression. And I think it captures the relationship between the old and the new covenant. I think it captures it well. Even though John may not be trying to say all that, I'm not sure. But I think it does, grace upon grace. It's a blossoming of everything that came before, not a replacement of. So what do other people think about the relationship? I have a chart for you. You need a chart. And Jude, would y'all mind passing them out? Can you walk around and stuff? Here, I need one.
Barely.
All right. We need a whiteboard, yeah. That would be fantastic. I need that. That's right, yeah. All right, this is not absolute, inerrant, infallible truth. This is, my best attempt at summarizing faithful to the position, what these different groups hold to. And all of the people on here, generally speaking, are good people and love Jesus. But what they believe about the relationship between the Old and the New Testament is going to have big ramifications for the culture of their church and how their church lives out its faith. For example, we wrote a letter to the city council condemning their public proclamation of sodomy. That flows out of our understanding of the relationship between the Old and the New Covenant. It really does. How can such a big theological issue be that practical? It is very much that practical. This is the issue that divides all the various quote-unquote Reformed churches and evangelical churches, I should say, not just Reformed. The evangelical churches in general are divided largely because of these differences haven't been hashed out yet. Does that mean we hate everybody? No. We love them, and if I had to move to another town and I didn't have any other options, it would be hard to go to a classic dispensationalist church, but I don't think it would be impossible. It might be impossible, but it sure would be hard. I'm gonna have to start a church, I guess. I don't know, but it depends, But anyway, so let's look at these real quick down the first chart here. You can see the Westminster, that's Calvin, Westminster West in Philadelphia. You can see all the way on the right side, I gave you some institutions and some famous scholars that are associated with that position. If you can see that, that's probably the funnest part to look at. So you got Westminster, and that is that the Mosaic covenant, the administration of the Mosaic covenant. Do y'all know what I mean by the administration, the ministry, that the form that the covenant of grace took at that moment, Jesus having not come, the form that it takes and the structure that it takes in that season. And there are different seasons because Jesus has to come in time, right? But the administration of the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, was a form or a stage of God's overarching covenant of grace with his people. Okay, makes sense? That's what we believe. And so when Jesus comes and that form or that new administration of the covenant is inaugurated, it's a blossoming. Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. That's right. Now you can see the next section, though, particular Baptists. They don't call themselves that anymore. That's an old-fashioned word. Has anybody ever seen a particular Baptist church? I've seen, I lived in Virginia for 4 or 5 years, and they had them out in the country, particular Baptists. And then you also can keep driving, and there's a Free Will Baptist. And you can see at some point those groups fought, and they split up. And then we had, I was at an independent, fundamental, King James only, Bible-believing, pre-trib, pre-mill, on the frontage road, right? Independent Baptist Church. It wasn't that bad, but that's all the things that they believe. And they thought the free will guys and the particular guys were both wrong. They're crazy. So anyway, particular Baptist just means Reformed Baptist, Calvinistic. They believe in God's election or God's sovereignty. And you can see that they believe that the Mosaic administration, that first stage, is not the covenant of grace. It is distinct from the covenant of grace. It is an extension of the covenant of works that God established with Adam in the garden, before the fall. Okay? So they would say Adam had a covenant of works, he failed it. Israel had a covenant of works, they failed it. Jesus came and fulfilled the covenant of works. So that's kind of how they think. So they don't think of the Mosaic covenant as a covenant of grace. They think it's a covenant of works. And now they do believe that the covenant of grace was still during that time period, in a sense, that Israelites were as individuals saved by grace, but the laws that you read, and when the Bible says, do this and live, God is saying to Israel, temporarily, for a short period of time, if you follow these rules, these conditions, I will give you prosperity in the land. So that the blessings were temporal and they were physical and they were for Israel. Now, what flows from that is the belief that the civil laws are for Israel and that they're temporal and they're for that land, that they're not for today. So if you held to, I don't know how people like Jeff Durbin hold to this. I don't know. There's some sort of a hodgepodge or eclectic thing where they believe God's law is for civil societies today and nations today, yet they say they're Baptist. If they are Baptist, it means they have to believe that the Mosaic administration is a covenant of works. So I don't know how they do that, but they're not 1689 Federalists, but these 1689 Federalist guys, this is what they hold to. And so you're not going to see them engaged in the civil sphere in the same way. They're going to be relating to things a little bit differently. And you're not going to see them relating to the promises in the same way. Okay, you know how I say my hermeneutic is called, that's mine. When I read the Old Testament, I see a promise, I say, that's mine. Because I believe that was all a part of the covenant of grace and that I've been grafted into the promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the promises. Okay? They don't have a that's mine. They don't like that. They have a that's Israel's. That's their hermeneutic. Some of it's theirs, but some of it's Israel's. So I say, that's mine. They would say, not so fast. That's Israel's. See what I mean? So I would read the promises to children. I'd say, that's mine. And they'd say, no, that's Israel's. So it affects things. It affects baptism. It affects how you feel towards your children, I would say. Fortunately, when I was Baptistic, I felt good about my kids, but I was intellectually inconsistent. This is a lot to work through. So it's just a lot. Now you can see down here, republication. That's Westminster West. That's out in California. And that is Meredith Kline and Michael Horton, the White Horse Inn, Pilgrim Theology. I don't know if you've heard these things. So this would be like Parish Church and Hope Presbyterian in Opelousas. And most of the PCA, conservative Reformed Presbyterians, this is what they would hold to, republication. So unfortunately, I am out of the Baptist camp, and I'm also out of the Presbyterian camp, at least locally. There's tons of Presbyterians that hold to the Westminster thing. There's just none around here. So republication, you can see it's mixed. It's covenant of grace with an added works principle. So think of it this way: they had the Mosaic covenant. They say is a continuation of the covenant of grace, but then God layers on top of it a works principle for Israel temporarily in the land. If they do this really well, then they can have all the blessings in the land. So they're not going to either. They're also not going to believe all those promises are ours. They're going to delineate. Some are for Israel, some are for us. And they're also not going to believe that all the laws are for us today either. You basically have Westminster, the original one, classic reform, saying it's all the covenant of grace. That's mine. That's our promises. Those are our laws. And then you have the other groups which put a parenthesis of some sort around the Mosaic administration. Does that make sense? For those of you who care, right? All right. All right. You got classic dispensationalism, which I don't think anyone believes that anymore. But they say that's for Israel. That Old Testament's for Israel, New Testament's for us, and there's no nuance there. They believe it's two different pathways of salvation, completely different pathways. And then you got progressive dispensationalists, which modified that a little bit while also not upsetting the rich and wealthy donors. Sort of a thing like, we have to make sure we don't go all the way away from dispensationalism because the trustees are all very old and still hardcore. Like, I don't know their motives, but you take dispensationalism and you just kind of shift it over a little bit and say, no, we are one church. We are one church. But there's different roles. So that's kind of what progressive dispensationalism says. In the millennium, when Jesus returns, there's going to be different roles for Israel in the church, but we are still one. And so it's just a modified dispensationalism. You can see the groups that hold to that. There's going to probably be quite a few churches in Acadiana that hold to that. I just don't know their pastors. So that's that. Yeah, that's kind of what all separates us. Any questions or any thoughts on that? Yeah? Wait, what? Yeah, MacArthur. I would say MacArthur's probably the last one, yeah, or somewhere in there. There's a few other ones on here I don't have. I don't have the New Perspective on Paul. I don't have Roman Catholicism. Don't have Eastern Orthodox. Don't have the Coptic Church or the Ethiopian Church. I'm not sure where they're at on that, but you got to, draw the line somewhere. So Leviticus 18:5. Let's see if we can practice this. So you see that, like when I read that, I'm reading it through a certain lens, like my presuppositions that I've come to. And I read that, you shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person, Brandon, this is you, does them, and this is Christ Church and all your friends, if he shall live by them, yes, that's mine. I like that. And it's not that it's work salvation. It's the phrase we use is this is how we can intensify our blessings if we obey God. Which laws in the Bible? All of the laws. I don't do a lot of chopping. Like, I think the Westminster view is the simplest and easiest one. She's like, how much of the Bible's for you? All of it, right? Now, you have to know how to read it. You have to know how to read it in light of the New Testament and the fulfillment of Jesus. You have to know what sacrificing a lamb means in its essence, not in its form. You have to know what the land means, not in the form, but in the essence. What is the land? What does Paul say the land is? It's the world. It's a type. It's a type of the world. So, but other people are going to read that, and they're going to knee-jerk reaction to it. I promise you. They're going to knee-jerk. They'll be like, they're not going to. they're gonna like, that's out of context. That's not what it means. That you can't just go around taking promises like that. It's gonna irk them. They may or may not know. It's because they have been taught in a particular system. Most likely they don't know, but it's that they've been taught in a different covenantal system unwittingly, and so it's going to be a little bit more chopping for them. They might actually hear me say that and say that's prosperity gospel, what he's teaching over there. I've actually heard that before. It's not prosperity gospel. It's just covenantal gospel. And so, all right. Let me see. Let's move on to verse. There was one other thing I wanted to point out. Okay, just to make a quick argument for you as to why I believe that it's all one covenant. Just quick. We've spent hours on this in other classes. But God's people were always justified how? By grace through faith. That was true for Abraham. It was true for Habakkuk, where Habakkuk said, I can't remember the verse now. It was true for Martin Luther. And it's true for us today that justification is by grace through faith. It was never a works situation, okay? Blessings, I believe, have always been received by grace through faith that works. There was never a point in history where God blessed faithless obedience. That was always condemned. When the Israelites obey the commandments of God, it's just like when we obey. They loved him, they trusted him, and so they obeyed his commandments. Right? Faith works. It's the same paradigm. There's no shifting of that whatsoever. No, every single person that's ever been saved has been saved in the exact same way, all the way across. Now, Paul calls the promises given to Abraham the gospel. So we have some very clear proof texts that what's going on with Abraham is definitely the covenant of grace. It's what we have. The question then emerges, what about in the Mosaic administration? Is that a parenthesis? But I find over and over and over again, things mentioned in the Mosaic administration applied to the Gentile churches. Okay, for example, in the book of Ephesians, Paul talks about the household of God. Remember, the church is a household. And we talked about that last week, right? Was that last week? Or was that Wednesday night? Wednesday night. Y'all should listen. If you weren't there, you should listen to that class online. It's called She Builds Her House. It's I think it was very interesting. But Paul talks about the household, and then he says, I want you to know how to behave in the household. And he says, wives like this, husbands like this, children like this, slaves and masters like this. It's a household, the church, and he's describing all the different categories in the households that make up his Gentile church in Ephesus. And to the children, he says, obey and honor your parents in the Lord. Why? Why does he say that? Because that's the first commandment with the promise that you will live long in the land that the Lord your God would bring you. Say, wait a second. They're in Ephesus, right? They're Gentiles. Paul understands that the Mosaic administration was a different form of the covenant of grace and that these promises and these commandments are still in effect. And so he applies it to the children, mind you, who are in the covenant, in the church of Ephesus, the Mosaic promises. So you see that there's a lot of things like this. Paul takes the law of Moses about feeding oxen and applies it in the New Testament church to why you should pay your Bible teachers and the Levites. You have tons and tons of examples like this where the law is repeated in the New Testament and just assumed as a part of God's gracious relationship to us. I mean, which book of the Bible is the most quoted book in the New Testament? It's Deuteronomy. That's right. It's Deuteronomy is the most quoted book in the New Testament. Hebrews 11, the list of the faithful in Hebrews 11. Are y'all familiar with that list? They're all saved by grace through faith. All of them, whether they're in Moses' time, Abraham's time, all of the above. Romans 3:31. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? Paul's talking about, is the relationship between the old and the new an overthrow? Is it a complete repeal? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. So that was the whole debate in the New Testament. The Pharisees and scribes are telling the New Testament Christians, you're condemning Moses. And Jesus and Paul and all of them, no, we're fulfilling Moses. We're what Moses was always pointing to. Okay? Which means they are actually the ones who loved Moses. Let's go down to John chapter 9, verse 28. See if we can skip down. And they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." John 5:45, "Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would have believed me." So you see, there's continuity there. "For he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" So this is a big debate in the Gospel of John. That was John 9 and John 5. What is the relationship between the Old and the New Testament? Right here in the prologue is where he introduces it, and he introduces the relationship. It's not a replacement. It's not instead of. It's grace upon grace. So a lot came through Moses, but now the fullness comes through Jesus. Moses set the stage. He was a servant in the household of God, but Jesus is the Son. And that's the relationship between the two. All right, and we're done. Have a great Lord's Day.